Good afternoon. I remember standing at this podium 12 months ago under very different circumstances. At that time we were in the midst of an uncertain economy that was clearly on a downward trend. Today, still uncertain, but certainly less so, and seemingly on an upward trend. Last year our production volume was declining, this year increasing. And last year our liquidity was insecure, this year strong and stable, and we're able to focus all of our energy on the market. So at the outset of the meeting, I'm happy to report that the company is in a much better position. What I'd like to do today is to look at our recent progress in the market, and then look at the wider overall market development, and finally to conclude with some considerations for an outlook for the rest of 2010. So let's begin by reviewing our progress and growth with the aid of this graph, which shows our production in engine equivalents from mid-2006 until the first quarter, which we just reported on recently. And what I'd like to begin with is to show the total volume. That's all of the programs. And we can see the development in this trend line. We see that we had a rather stable production in the early years. And this is because the initial programs, the Ford V6, the Audi V6, the Hyundai engine, they had all started production and more or less ramped up to their mature volume. So we had a steady growth. In early 2007, we started to get approval of new programs in the commercial vehicle sector, and they phased into production at the end of 2007 and through 2008, which led us to our peak of approximately 750,000 engine equivalents in September of 2008. Of course, from that time, we had the onset of the economic crisis, and our volumes declined until we met our low exactly 1 year ago today. And what's interesting to see about the low is that it effectively erased 3 years of good progress and development in our volumes. From the low period, we've had a nice increase. And what I'd like to do is to discuss if that increase is a recovery or if it's indeed from new programs. Yeah? If it's a recovery, it means that the programs that started before our September 2008 peak have started to regain volume. And so we've divided now the production into those earlier programs that had already started production before the peak. And obviously that line traces until September 2008. And what we see at that point is 5 consecutive quarters of declining volume. And now in the most recent report for first quarter 2010, what seems to be the start of some sort of an increase. And we can then look at the new programs, the programs that started since September 2008. And what we see in this trend is the pre-production volume, where the OEMs are developing, filling the pipe and developing stock parts for service and warranty purposes. And then this ramp up of production. And it's very obvious that the total curve almost exactly parallels the curve of the new programs. And so what we see from this is that the growth is coming from the new programs. And although there's a lot of discussion in the market about recovery in the economy, it's still too early for SinterCast to refer to a recovery of the previous programs. It's interesting to see that at this point, the old programs and the new programs have effectively the same volume, so we're getting 50% from old and new. And when we refer to these new programs, it's principally the Ford 6.7 liter engine and the exhaust components that we're producing at the Dashang foundry in China. So the Ford 6.7 is a very interesting program. The U.S. volume this year is forecast to be 11.5 million passenger vehicle sales. And the so-called Super Duty size class, which is participated in by Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, is forecast at about 400,000 units. Yeah? So it's less than 4%. But even though these super duties are less than 4% of the total market, they represent 20 to 25% of the profit. So not only are they very important programs for SinterCast, but they're also very important programs for Ford. With regard to the exhaust components, that is turbocharger housings and exhaust manifolds, and we've had a very successful ramp-up in China, both for export to Europe and also for the domestic Chinese market. And we currently have 10 different programs, 10 different components in production. So let's look at the progress and growth in a different way, and we can focus on that the programs that started production before September 2008, and we see the same trend line developing. And what I'd like to do now is to break it down between car programs, truck programs, and others. And when we say others, we mean primarily industrial power, because before September 2008, we hadn't really started the exhaust component production. So if we begin by looking at cars, we can see that from 2006 to mid-2007, most of the total volume came from passenger vehicle V engines. Since that point, we had the ramp-up of the trucks, and the growth here is primarily on the back of the commercial vehicle market. And we see a gradual decline with the difficult economy until we hit a bottom again exactly 1 year ago now. And there's two ways to look at this. First, we can feel happiness because we have 4 consecutive quarters of increase. It's also good news that the volume has effectively doubled from something just over 100,000 to over 200,000, so a 100% increase. But also the painful part of it is that the volume that we reported in the first quarter of 2010 is still far below what we had in the first quarter of 2006. So again, I don't feel at all comfortable using the recovery word in any of the SinterCast reporting. We haven't yet seen a sufficient recovery in the older programs. We can do the same and look at trucks, and as I said earlier, the truck production began in mid-2007, so we had the ramp-up, which was shown here in the total as well, and then unfortunately, again, 5 consecutive quarters of decline, where the first quarter of 2010 was the first time to see some improvement. And likewise in the industrial power sector, and as we've said in some of the interim reports and in the annual report, the industrial power sector has been less affected by the economic crisis. So we see a rather stable baseline, even though there's slightly more variation around it. I think that it's always dangerous to draw a straight line with only 2 points, but it is promising to see that all 4 of these curves in the first quarter of 2010 are trending upwards. And let us watch over the next few quarters to see how that develops. If the economy is recovering, perhaps it will pull along our programs. And it'll be very interesting to see the balance between the newer programs and these older programs as they improve. We can also look at the market development in terms of our penetration, and looking first at what we call waves 1 and 3 of our 5-wave scenario, the passenger vehicle V-diesel engines. Again, on the back of the Ford 6.7-liter engine, we've had a very good growth in these sectors. Our total production today is around 575,000 engine equivalent in a total market of about 2 million, and that gives us a penetration of almost 30%. And I think that's really a fantastic development that all of us can be very proud of. On the commercial vehicle side, as you've seen in the last 5 quarters, our volume has been declining, so we're lower. And the total market has also declined. So we sit at something like a 3% market share, which is very small. But at the same time, we have more than 10 commercial vehicle products in series production today. So they provide a very credible reference. And the volume is fairly high, and we're producing them in many different foundries around the world. So we have a very good reference, and sitting at 2.5% market penetration, what it shows is that there's a lot of opportunity for growth right there in the market that needs CGI the most. So a good penetration, a good reference, and in both sectors a lot of opportunities to improve. I mentioned earlier that the U.S. market forecast for 2011 is 11.5 million passenger vehicles. Last year the U.S. finished at 10.4 million. So if we take that as the baseline, it's something like a 10% recovery. It will be interesting to see how Europe develops this year. The European market was artificially propped up last year by a lot of car scrappage, cash for clunker schemes. Most of those in the Eurozone have now been finished. So it'll be interesting to see how the volumes finish here in Europe. But we certainly couldn't expect anything better than a 10% recovery here. Regarding the overall market development, I think it's best to look at trucks and construction equipment, because those are the best indicators of overall economic growth. And there's a plot here which we reference from our friends at ZF, the transmission people. And there's a lot of information, so let's take a moment to digest it. And what we see is total market volume in these columns, and that is to be read on the left axis. This is for trucks greater than 6 ton. And then these individual lines for the different countries or zones, geographical zones, and those volumes are to be read from the right axis. And what we see is that the market peaked in 2007 or 2008, and then we had this very severe drop-off in 2009 that isn't a surprise to anyone. And we show here approximately a 10% recovery also for commercial vehicles in 2010. And you can see then that the recovery starts to accelerate in 11 and 12, where we get back to where we were in 2007 and 2008. It's interesting to see that the slope of these lines are the same before the decline and after. And so, again, something like 10% recovery. With regard to the individual countries and zones, we see that North America felt the effects first of the economic crisis and had this very severe drop-off in commercial vehicle volumes. Western Europe wasn't immune to it, so a year and a half later it started its decline. And here we see in China just a flattening of the growth, but really no major impact. And this in large part explains why we've put so much emphasis lately in our marketing efforts in China and why we've established the office in Shanghai. And of course, the FAW, First Automobile Works mini-system installation, which we announced in January. And coincidentally, our engineers are there this week making the installation. So what we see in the early years is that China, Europe, and America were more or less equal, each accounting for about 25% of the market. With the decline in the West, China has become about 50% of the total market. And as the market recovers, it will return to being something like 1/3 of the total market. And here in Western Europe and North America, where all of our commercial vehicle components are sold, we can, if this plot is right, expect a recovery on the order of 10% starting this year and then accelerating in 2011 and 12. So again, different ways to grow. Either the new programs ramp up on their own accord, or the older programs get carried along as the market improves. We can also look at the market development in terms of some of our engines, and I'd like to discuss for a moment the Audi 3-liter V6. This engine was initially starting production at the Tupi foundry in Brazil in 2004, and at the end of last month, Audi made an announcement that they will release a Generation 2 upgrade for the engine this year. The new engine will have 3 different power levels. It has a 10% torque increase from 500 to 550 Newton meters. And most interestingly for our group, is that these 3 different power level engines will replace the 2.7 liter V6. So many of you will know that the 2.7 liter V6 started production in CGI, and after 2.5 or 3 years, it was converted back to gray iron. And the Audi V6 is dual-sourced between Tupi in Brazil and the Eisenwerk Brühl foundry in Germany. And Tupi produces both the 2.7 and the 3 liter, whereas Eisenwerk Brühl produces only the 3 liter. So as the 2.7 volumes are transferred to 3 liter, we should see a benefit of that in our volumes. So that's the good news. The bad news, unfortunately, as the Audi design engineers become more familiar and more skilled in their CGI designs, they've managed to reduce the weight of the block by 6.5 kilos, which for this engine is about 10%. So the first 10% of that volume transfer from the 2.7 to the 3 will be completely washed by the weight reduction. But nonetheless, we will see an increase in volume from that program. While they took 6.5 kilos out of the block, they took 25 kilos out of the fully assembled engine. And so the block was also obviously contributing to that. And they've improved the fuel economy and reduced the CO2 emissions by 22 to 29%. And of course, as a 2010 engine, it is Euro 5 compliant. So if we look in a little bit more detail at this engine, we can see this is from Audi, the original Generation 1 engine, and here the high power Generation 2 engine and the lower power Generation 2 engine with a 22 to 29% reduction in both fuel economy and the grams per kilometer of CO2 emissions. So from a 3 liter engine, I think that 159 grams per kilometer is really fantastic. And you can see that Audi is earning its tagline, this leadership through technology tagline. And Audi has also taken the opportunity to benchmark their CGI engine, and they've been a very supportive advocate of compacted graphite iron and SinterCast. We see here the Generation 1 engine with 218 kilo total weight, the Generation 2 engine 193 kilos, so there are 25 kilo reduction. And here they compare the engine to the nearest competitor V6 with an aluminum cylinder block. And isn't it fantastic? Who would have thought 10 years ago that an engine with an iron cylinder block could be 15 kilograms lighter than the similar size engine with an aluminum cylinder block, 8% lighter. And if we compare it to another competitive 3 liter diesel in the market, this is an inline engine, so the weight is only 7 kilos heavier, but you can see that we're almost 300 millimeters shorter, so a real advantage for packaging. And I will say that through all of the difficulty in the economy of the last year and a half, this is the engine that held its volumes the best. This was a very good seller, and as you know, Audi did very well in the market, and so this engine has been a very good performer for us over the last year and a half. Right, so with that, let's have some considerations for an outlook for 2010. It seems that there is an improving global market, and SinterCast should benefit from that in 2 ways. First, the new program should have a very positive ramp-up, and secondly, the older programs should be carried along with this recovery. So 2 good opportunities for growth. This year we've had the increase in production very early in the year, and as you know, in the first quarter report, we reported 900,000 engine equivalents. So we'll benefit from that throughout the whole year, and that will give us a good start for our full year result. For those of you who have followed us in previous years, you know that we've usually had that increase toward the end of the year and never got a full 12-month benefit from it. So this is a nice starting point for us. And as more engines come onto the market with CGI cylinder blocks, and as they tend to be class-leading engines, they become our best sales messages. and the awareness in CGI increases, and it's now very common for OEMs when starting a new engine program to include CGI as one of the design alternatives. And this means that we're getting increased numbers of development programs also in the inline diesel sector and even in the petrol sector. So a very positive development for us there. Over the previous years, we've had a fairly consistent frequency of introducing new products, and today, of course, presenting the Audi 3-litre. And there's no reason to expect why we won't have a similar frequency going into the future. So we absolutely look forward to new product launches, both in 2010 and beyond. And also opportunities for new installations. And we didn't have any new installations last year. Capital expenditure in the foundry industry last year was simply frozen, and there was no way around that. And although it is not completely opened, there are ongoing discussions for new installations, either for mini systems or for full systems. And we've already had the FAW commitment this year, and let us hope that we have more installation commitments this year. And certainly as the economy continues to improve, there will be more installations. And with this as a background, we've said many times in the past that for break-even, SinterCast needs something around 1 million engine equivalents per year and some revenue from installations. And given that we're already at 900,000 at the start of the year and we've got the FAW installation under our belt, we have every opportunity for a positive cash flow result for the full year. In 2007 and 2008, the cash flow result was our absolute priority, and we deferred some other activities to get the best possible result. We're in a different position today. Today the cash box is stronger, and as we go through the rest of the year, if we see good opportunities for investment, we'll prioritize those ahead of the cash flow result. For example, if we find a good salesperson in China, we'll bring that person on board. If we find a good research engineer who can help our technical development, we'll bring that person on board, and we'll prioritize that investment so that we can have a better growth in the future. So in conclusion, I'm happy to report that we're in a much better position. The recent increase in production, the successful launch of the System 3000, and the securing of the liquidity last year has provided a deep sense of optimism and motivation for the employees. And I'm absolutely confident that we have the resources and the competences to do the things that we need to do. Thank you.
Okay.